The Life and Legacy of George Washington. A sleep narration. Close your eyes now and let yourself settle into this moment. Feel the weight of your body against the surface beneath you. Let your breathing slow, becoming deeper, more rhythmic, like the gentle tide against a distant shore. Tonight you are going to take a journey, not through space, but through time. You will walk alongside a man whose life helped shape a nation, whose decisions echoed long after he was gone, and whose humanity remained constant even as his legend grew. There is nothing you need to do, nothing you need to remember. Simply listen and let the story carry you, the way a wide river carries fallen leaves. Part 1, The Beginning. It is February 22nd, 1732. Though history will later adjust the date forward by 11 days, when the British colonies adopt the Gregorian calendar. For now, the world knows only winter. You stand near Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. The land is still and cold. Bare trees stretch their branches toward a pale sky, and smoke rises from chimneys in slow, drifting lines. Inside a modest plantation house, a child has just been born. He is the first son of Augustine Washington and his second wife, Mary Ball Washington. They name him George. The house itself is solid, rather than elegant, built for function and endurance. This is not the home of one of Virginia's great aristocratic families, but of people firmly rooted in the land. The Washingtons belong to what historians later call the middling gentry, planters with property, ambition, and social standing, but without inherited titles or vast inherited wealth. Their lives are defined by effort, by calculation, by steady work over generations. Nearby, the Potomac River moves quietly through the landscape. Wide and dependable, it connects inland farms to the broader Atlantic world. Long before George Washington understands politics or power, this river is already part of him, a constant presence that will guide trade, travel, military strategy, and eventually the geography of a new nation. The world George is born into is shaped by tobacco. Fields are cleared from forest, soil is worked hard, and the rhythm of life follows planting and harvest. This economy depends on enslaved labor, a reality woven into daily existence and rarely questioned in the Virginia of the 1730s. Enslaved men, women, and children live and work on the Washington properties, sustaining the household and its ambitions. This truth will remain with George throughout his life. An inherited system that benefits him deeply, and one he will struggle to reconcile with his evolving sense of morality and responsibility. George's childhood is not anchored to a single place. Augustine Washington is a restless, forward-looking man, always seeking opportunity. When George is 3 years old, the family moves north to Little Hunting Creek along the Potomac. The land there is promising, closer to trade routes, closer to the wider world. 3 years later, they move again, this time to Ferry Farm, across the Rappahannock River from the growing town of Fredericksburg. Each move brings change, but also familiarity. Forests give way to fields. Rivers remain ever-present. From an early age, George learns that land is both opportunity and responsibility, something to be measured, improved, and defended. He watches adults negotiate boundaries, manage workers, and worry over harvests and finances. Without realizing it, he is absorbing lessons that will serve him for decades to come. For now, though, he is simply a boy growing up on the edge of wilderness and settlement, in a world that values discipline, endurance, and reputation. The foundations of his character are being laid quietly, day by day, shaped by family, land, and the unspoken expectations of colonial Virginia. And as this early chapter draws to a close, change waits just ahead. Lessons learned not in comfort, but through loss, responsibility, and the wide open spaces of the natural world. Let yourself rest here for a moment as the story prepares to move forward. George's education is practical rather than classical. Unlike some of his wealthier contemporaries, young men sent across the Atlantic to study in England, George remains in Virginia. His learning takes place at home, in small local schools, and through careful self-discipline. There is no Latin rhetoric echoing through grand halls, no formal university training. Instead, there is usefulness, precision, application. He studies mathematics with particular care, especially the kind that can be put to work. Arithmetic, geometry, and trigonometry, tools suited for land measurement and navigation. Surveying, in colonial Virginia, is not merely a technical skill, it is a pathway to opportunity. Land defines wealth, status, and power, and the ability to measure it accurately opens doors that might otherwise remain closed. In his notebooks, George copies out problems again and again, his calculations clean and deliberate. Alongside the numbers, he transcribes a list of moral instructions, known as the rules of civility and decent behavior in company and conversation. These are not original compositions, but carefully copied maxims drawn from earlier English sources. They instruct a young man how to sit, how to speak, how to restrain his temper, how to move through society with control and restraint. These exercises serve more than one purpose. They refine his penmanship, neat, balanced, and steady, and they impress upon him the importance of self-command. Even in boyhood, he is practicing the art of discipline, learning to govern himself long before he will ever be asked to govern others. Outside the schoolroom, George is most at ease in the open air. He grows quickly, taller than many boys his age, his frame strong and capable. He rides horses across fields and along riverbanks, moving easily through the Virginia countryside. He learns the land not from maps alone, but from direct experience, through mud and brush, through heat and cold, through long days spent outdoors. Forests and rivers become familiar companions. He learns how the ground rises and falls, where water gathers after rain, how paths form naturally through the terrain. This intimacy with the landscape will stay with him, shaping not only his profession as a surveyor, but later his instincts as a military commander. Then, in 1743, when George is just 11 years old, the steady structure of his world breaks. His father, Augustine Washington, dies after a brief illness. The loss is profound and immediate. With Augustine gone, the family's future must be reorganized, its resources carefully divided. According to the customs of the time, the bulk of the estate passes to George's older half-brothers from Augustine's first marriage. George inherits Ferry Farm and 10 slaves, but the property will remain under his mother's control until he comes of age. The inheritance, while not insignificant, does not guarantee security or advancement. Without a father to guide him, and without the wealth or connections enjoyed by some of his peers, George's prospects narrow sharply. From this moment forward, necessity begins to shape ambition. Marybelle Washington, his mother, assumes full responsibility for his upbringing. She is a formidable presence, deeply religious, financially cautious, and fiercely protective of her authority. The surviving letters and records suggest a relationship defined by obligation rather than tenderness. George will dutifully support her throughout her long life, ensuring her comfort and security, yet their correspondence lacks the warmth one might expect between mother and son. There is respect here, there is duty, but there is also distance. As the years pass, George grows into adolescence under the weight of expectation and restraint. He is serious, observant, and increasingly inward. Opportunities do not come easily. They must be earned through effort and precision. Now let yourself drift further into this quiet world. The room around you darkens. You are standing inside the modest hall of Ferry Farm. A single candle burns low on a wooden table. Its flame flickers as a tall teenage boy bends over his papers, carefully checking his figures. Outside, the Virginia night hums softly, crickets calling, an owl sounding in the distance. This is a turning point, though he does not yet know it. Beyond these walls, beyond the familiar rivers and fields, a wider world is beginning to open, through family ties, powerful patrons, and the call of lands waiting beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. George's future is uncertain, Without a large inheritance, and without the classical education enjoyed by many of his wealthier peers, his path forward is narrow and undefined. In colonial Virginia, birth and connections matter deeply. Talent alone is rarely enough. If George is to rise, he must do so through diligence, adaptability, and the careful cultivation of opportunity. At this crucial moment, his older half-brother Lawrence Washington becomes a guiding presence. Lawrence is everything that George is yet to be: polished, worldly, and well-connected. He has served as an officer in the British Army during the War of Jenkins' Ear, fighting alongside British regulars in the Caribbean. Through that service, he has formed relationships that extend well beyond Virginia's shores. Lawrence has married Anne Fairfax, linking the Washington family to one of the most powerful dynasties in the colony. He now lives on a Potomac River plantation he has renamed Mount Vernon, in honor of Admiral Edward Vernon, the British naval commander under whom he served. The house overlooks the river, facing the wider Atlantic world, and with it, the currents of influence and ambition that flow through colonial society. Lawrence takes George under his wing. He invites him to Mount Vernon, exposes him to refined company, and introduces him to the customs and expectations of Virginia's elite. Here, George observes how power is exercised, not loudly, but through confidence, reputation, and carefully managed relationships. Through Lawrence, George is introduced to Thomas, the sixth Lord Fairfax of Cameron. Lord Fairfax is an unusual figure in the colonies, an English nobleman who owns more than 5 million acres of land in Virginia's northern neck and beyond. His holdings stretch westward into the Shenandoah Valley, a vast and still imperfectly mapped region beyond the Blue Ridge Mountains. Such land cannot manage itself. Boundaries must be defined. Claims must be surveyed. Roads and rivers must be recorded. Lord Fairfax needs capable, trustworthy surveyors, young men who can endure hardship, measure accurately, and keep meticulous records. In 1748, when George is just 16 years old, he is given such an opportunity. Let the scene unfold around you. You are on horseback, moving steadily upward as the road climbs into the Blue Ridge Mountains. The air grows cooler with each turn of the path. Behind you, the tidewater country spreads out in a distant patchwork of fields, rivers, and settlements. Ahead, the mountains rise in soft, overlapping folds, their slopes washed in blue haze, their interior still largely unknown. The surveying party is small, but experienced. There are seasoned woodsmen and surveyors who know how to navigate forest and stream. Young George carries the tools of the trade: chains for measurement, a compass for direction, paper and ink for recording each line and angle. He learns by doing, step by step, mile by mile. The expedition lasts for weeks. Nights are spent beneath open skies, the stars sharp and close above. Mornings begin with frost on the ground and breath visible in the cold air. They ride through forests so dense that sunlight struggles to reach the earth below. Rivers must be forded. Camps must be made and broken again. George keeps a journal, recording distances, landmarks, and impressions. These notes survive to this day. In them, he writes of rough terrain, uncertain paths, and encounters with Native Americans who already know these lands intimately. People whose presence reminds him that this frontier is not empty, but contested and complex. The experience leaves a lasting mark. He learns self-reliance, born of necessity. He learns to read weather, water, and terrain. Most of all, he begins to understand the sheer scale of the continent, stretching westward beyond the settled coast, a land filled with promise, danger, and consequence. When George returns to the Tidewater, he does not return as a boy. He begins working professionally as a surveyor, now commissioned by the colony. The work pays well, far better than most occupations open to someone his age. More importantly, it provides access. Surveyors see land before others do. They understand its value, its potential, and its risks. By his late teens, George is purchasing frontier parcels of his own. Small at first, then gradually more ambitious. It is the beginning of a lifelong pursuit, acquiring, managing, and defending land. By the time of his death, decades later, he will be among the wealthiest landowners in Virginia. But for now, he is still young, still learning, standing at the threshold of a wider world, one that is drawing him steadily toward responsibility, conflict, and history. Let the story rest here for a moment as the mountains fade into memory and the next chapter quietly approaches. Just as George's ambitions begin to take clearer shape, fate intervenes once more. In 1751, illness enters the family with quiet persistence. Lawrence Washington, George's older half-brother and closest guide, has contracted tuberculosis. The disease weakens him steadily, draining his strength and dimming the future he had so carefully constructed. Physicians offer little hope, but there is one possibility left: distance, warmth, and a change of climate. In desperate search of a cure, Lawrence resolves to sail to Barbados, where the tropical air is believed to restore failing lungs. George goes with him, not as an observer, but as a companion and caretaker. It will be George's only journey beyond the North American mainland, and the first time he leaves the familiar world of Virginia behind entirely. The voyage itself is long and slow. Weeks pass at sea. Let yourself stand at the ship's rail. The Atlantic stretches endlessly in every direction, its surface rising and falling in steady, hypnotic motion. The water is a deeper blue than any river George has ever known. There are days of wind and days of stillness, nights filled with stars unbroken by land or light. The familiar rhythms of life dissolve into the creak of timbers and the constant breath of the ocean. When land finally appears, it feels almost unreal. Barbados rises green and dense from the sea, its air heavy with heat and moisture. The island is alive with movement. Sugar plantations worked by enslaved laborers, merchants, and officers crowding the port. The sharp contrast between wealth and suffering, visible at every turn. George records what he sees in a diary, noting the intensity of the sun, the bustle of the colonial capital, and the strangeness of a world shaped by the sugar trade rather than tobacco. Then illness strikes again. George contracts smallpox. The disease comes on violently. Fever, weakness, isolation. For days, his life hangs in the balance. He survives, but not unchanged. The illness leaves him permanently scarred, marks he will carry on his face for the rest of his life. Yet it also grants him something unseen at the time: immunity to a disease that will later ravage armies and camps across the colonies. Some historians will later suggest that this single, terrible episode may have saved his life during the Revolutionary War, when smallpox proves deadlier than enemy fire. For now, though, it is simply suffering endured and survival earned. Lawrence, however, does not recover. The climate fails him. His strength continues to ebb, and hope fades with it. The brothers return to Virginia, crossing the same ocean in reverse, but under very different circumstances. Back at Mount Vernon, Lawrence's condition worsens. The house that once represented promise and connection becomes a place of quiet decline. In July of 1752, Lawrence Washington dies. George is just 20 years old. With Lawrence's death, another stabilizing pillar of his world collapses. Mentor, protector, and model, all gone. The loss is deeply personal, but it is also consequential. Mount Vernon, Lawrence's estate, will pass through complex legal arrangements, and George's relationship to it will change slowly over time. Responsibility presses closer now. Expectation grows heavier. Once again, George stands at a threshold. Part 2. Military Beginnings, 1754-1763. The Virginia frontier is restless. Beyond the settled farms and river towns of the Tidewater, tension is building in the vast interior of the continent. The Ohio country, stretching west of the Appalachian Mountains toward the Mississippi River, is rich in land, rivers, and promise. Both Britain and France claim it. Neither is willing to yield. Each seeks the support of Native American nations, whose alliances will decide the balance of power. By the early 1750s, the rivalry has sharpened into something more dangerous. French forts are appearing along key waterways. British traders report increasing pressure. What has long been a distant imperial dispute is now moving closer to Virginia's borders. In 1753, Virginia's lieutenant governor, Robert Dinwiddie, decides to act. He must send a formal message to the French commanders in the Ohio country, warning them to withdraw from territory claimed by Britain. The mission is risky. It will require weeks of travel through wilderness, careful diplomacy, and the ability to observe and report military conditions. For this task, Dinwiddie selects George Washington. Washington is only 21 years old, but the choice is deliberate. He has proven himself capable in difficult terrain. He understands frontier travel. He has demonstrated discipline, endurance, and discretion. And perhaps most importantly, he has shown that he can be trusted. Washington accepts without hesitation. Picture the journey as it begins in October of 1753. You are riding north and west from Williamsburg, leaving behind paved roads and familiar settlements. The party is small, by necessity: a translator, a handful of seasoned frontiersmen, and several native guides who know the paths ahead. Supplies are limited. Time is short. Autumn has reached the forests. Leaves burn gold and red against dark trunks. Rivers run high with seasonal rain. Progress is slow. The group follows narrow trails, many of them long-used indigenous paths, winding through forests that seem to stretch without end. Each mile carries them deeper into contested ground. At Logstown, near the forks of the Ohio River in present-day Pennsylvania, Washington meets with leaders of the Seneca and other native nations. These meetings are formal and deliberate, shaped by ritual and expectation. Words are chosen carefully. Gifts are exchanged. Everything passes through interpreters. Here, Washington begins to learn diplomacy as it is practiced on the frontier, where alliances are fluid, trust must be earned repeatedly, and European authority carries less weight than reputation and respect. He listens more than he speaks. He observes closely. From Logstown, the party presses northward toward the French stronghold at Fort Le Boeuf, near Lake Erie. The terrain grows colder, wetter, more unforgiving. When Washington finally delivers Dinwiddie's message to the French commander, the response is courteous, but unequivocal. The French claim the Ohio country. They will not withdraw. Washington does not argue. He records. He notes the size of the fort, the number of soldiers, the strength of the defenses. He watches how supplies are moved, how the men are quartered. His role has quietly shifted. He is no longer only a messenger. He is gathering intelligence. The return journey is worse than the outward one. Winter arrives early. Snow and ice slow their progress. Food runs low. At one point, Washington attempts to cross an icy river on a makeshift raft. It collapses, and he is thrown into freezing water. He nearly dies of exposure. Later, an unknown assailant fires at him from the woods. The shot misses. The moment passes, unexplained and unresolved, adding to the sense that the frontier itself has turned hostile. Still, he presses on. Exhausted, half-frozen, and carrying critical information, Washington finally reaches Williamsburg in January of 1754. He delivers his report to Dinwiddie, who orders it printed and distributed throughout the colonies and in Britain. The message is clear. Diplomacy has failed. War is coming. Let yourself pause here, in the cold hush of that winter moment. The long ride is over, but the path ahead is only beginning to take shape. What started as a mission of words will soon turn to action, and George Washington, scarcely older than a boy, is about to step into command. Washington's written account of the mission makes an immediate impression, clear, factual, and composed. It is published and circulated throughout the colonies and in Britain. For a young man barely past 20, this public exposure is remarkable. His name begins to travel faster than he ever has. Spoken in council chambers, read in newspapers, noted by men who shape policy. More importantly, Virginia decides to act. Based on Washington's intelligence, Colonial leaders conclude that British claims to the Ohio country must be asserted not with words, but with force. A military expedition is authorized. And when officers are selected, the choice is telling. George Washington is commissioned as a lieutenant colonel in the Virginia Regiment. He is no longer merely observing history. He is being asked to shape it. Let your breathing slow now, settling into the steady rhythm of a long march. Feel yourself moving forward through spring forests, boots pressing into damp earth, the air fresh with new growth. This is not exploration anymore. This is purpose. In April of 1754, Washington leads approximately 160 men westward toward the forks of the Ohio, the point where the Allegheny and Monongahela rivers meet to form the Ohio River itself. It is a place of immense strategic value, controlling movement and trade deep into the continent. The British intend to establish a fort there, marking their claim in timber and earth. But events move faster than plans. Before Washington's force can arrive, French troops complete their own stronghold at the site, Fort Duquesne. The objective shifts instantly. Construction gives way to confrontation. The wilderness that once demanded endurance now demands decisions under pressure. In May, Washington receives intelligence from his Native American allies that a French detachment is camped nearby. Acting quickly, he leads a small force through darkness and rain, moving silently through narrow paths just before dawn. The tension is sharp, contained, breath held tight. The encounter that follows is brief and chaotic. It lasts no more than 15 minutes. Shots are fired. Smoke fills the clearing. In the confusion, the French commander, Joseph Coulon de Jumonville, is killed, along with several of his men. Survivors are taken prisoner. What exactly happened in that ravine will be argued over for generations. The French claim Jumonville was on a diplomatic mission, and that his killing was an assassination. The British insist it was a legitimate military engagement in contested territory. The truth lies tangled in fear, misunderstanding, and the volatile reality of the frontier. What is certain is this: the spark has been struck. This brief, violent clash helps ignite a wider war, one that will spread far beyond the forests of Pennsylvania, becoming the 7 Years' War, a global conflict fought across Europe, the Americas, Africa, and Asia. In that sense, George Washington has played a role, however unintended, in lighting the fuse. Aware that retaliation will come swiftly, Washington withdraws to a crude defensive position he names Fort Necessity. The name itself carries quiet foreboding. The site is poorly chosen, a low, marshy meadow surrounded by higher wooded ground. The fort is little more than a rough stockade and shallow trenches. In early July, French and Native American forces counterattack. They hold every advantage. Rain pours relentlessly, soaking powder and clothing alike, turning the ground into mud. From the surrounding tree line, French muskets fire downward into the fort. Washington's men, exhausted, wet, and outnumbered, struggle to respond. Casualties mount as the day drags on, the sound of gunfire merging with thunder and falling rain. Stay here for a moment, in that sodden meadow, as the pressure closes in. The young commander is facing something new now. Not exploration, not promise, but the weight of command under fire. The outcome, and what it teaches him, is about to matter more than he can yet imagine. As evening settles over the field, the fighting slows. Smoke hangs low. Rain continues to fall. The ground inside Fort Necessity has become a churned mixture of mud and blood. Ammunition is nearly gone. Men are exhausted, soaked through, and shaken. As darkness approaches, the French offer terms. Washington has little choice. His position is untenable. His defense is compromised. His command on the edge of collapse. He agrees to surrender. By lantern light, beneath steady rain, a document is produced, written in French. Washington signs it. Only later does its full meaning become clear. The terms include a statement that he has admitted to the assassination of Joseph Coulon de Jumonville. Washington will later insist that he did not understand the precise meaning of the word, as it was translated to him. Whether misunderstanding or mistranslation, the effect is lasting. The French seize upon the document as proof of wrongdoing. Washington carries the weight of it for years. Under the terms of surrender, he and his surviving men are allowed to withdraw. They march back toward Virginia, flags lowered, weapons carried but unused. They are alive, but humiliated. It is a bitter education. Yet when historians look closely at the record, something important becomes clear. Washington does not collapse under this failure. He does not abandon military service. He does not retreat into silence or obscurity. Instead, he absorbs the lesson. He studies what went wrong. He reflects on terrain, preparation, command, and communication. This is not the end of his military career. It is the beginning of his understanding. The following year, 1755, brings an even larger disaster and an even more decisive lesson. The British government, alarmed by events in the Ohio country, dispatches Major General Edward Braddock to remove the French presence by force. Braddock is a seasoned officer, trained in European warfare, confident in the discipline of British regulars. He commands a formidable army of red-coated soldiers, colonial militia, artillery, wagons, and support personnel. George Washington joins the expedition as a volunteer aide-de-camp. Officially, he holds no command. In practice, he is eager to learn. He wants to observe professional soldiers at work, to understand the methods of Europe's great armies. Now, you are marching through heavy July heat, part of a long column winding slowly through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. The line stretches for miles. Soldiers sweat beneath their uniforms. Axes ring as trees are felled to widen the road. Artillery creaks forward, dragged by teams of horses. Progress is steady, but painfully slow. The forest closes in on all sides. On July 9th, just 10 miles from their objective, the world erupts. French troops and Native American warriors spring in ambush from the woods. Musket fire cracks from unseen positions. Smoke and noise fill the air. The British regulars instinctively form tight ranks, attempting to maintain order and formation, the very discipline drilled into them for European battlefields. Here, it betrays them. Clustered together on narrow paths, they become easy targets. Officers shout commands that cannot be heard. Men fire blindly into trees. Confusion spreads faster than control. The forest itself seems to be attacking. General Braddock is struck by a bullet and falls mortally wounded. Panic ripples through the ranks. Nearly 2/3 of the officers are killed or injured. The army teeters on the edge of complete destruction. Through the chaos, Washington moves constantly. 2 horses are shot out from under him. Bullets tear through his coat. Yet he remains uninjured. He carries orders, rallies men, helps organize a fighting withdrawal. His presence, calm, visible, relentless, helps prevent total annihilation. When the remnants of the army finally retreat, the road behind them is littered with the dead and wounded. The experience sears itself into Washington's memory. He will never forget the screams of injured men, the terror of unseen enemies, the fatal rigidity of tactics unsuited to the land. He learns in the hardest possible way that leadership in America will require adaptation, that success depends on understanding terrain, flexibility, and restraint, not blind adherence to tradition. Let yourself rest here, as the echoes of gunfire fade into the trees. The young man who entered this war seeking experience is emerging changed, hardened by failure, sharpened by loss, and quietly preparing for trials yet to come. Let these scenes fade away now, like smoke thinning and dissolving into open air. You do not need to carry them with you. Simply acknowledge them as moments that shape the man George Washington is becoming, teaching him humility, teaching him the distance between theory and reality, teaching him that courage alone is never enough. For the next 3 years, Washington remains in uniform. As commander of the Virginia Regiment, he is responsible for defending a frontier that stretches for hundreds of miles. Isolated farms, scattered settlements, and narrow mountain passes vulnerable to sudden attack. It is grinding, thankless work. There are no grand victories here, no decisive battles. Only patrols, alarms, shortages, and constant uncertainty. His forces are never sufficient. Supplies arrive late, if at all. Weapons are scarce. Clothing wears out faster than it can be replaced. Washington writes relentlessly to Governor Dinwiddie and other colonial officials, filling pages with requests for men, for arms, for pay, for food. Many of these letters go unanswered. Others bring promises that never quite materialize. Through this frustration, he learns something as demanding as warfare itself: administration. He learns how authority moves through paperwork and influence rather than command alone. He learns how decisions are delayed by distance, politics, and competing priorities. He learns patience, not the quiet kind, but the hard, grinding patience required to function within bureaucracy. At the same time, he is learning how to lead men through prolonged hardship. Discipline is strict. Desertion is punished severely, sometimes by execution, a grim reflection of the era and the stakes involved. Yet Washington does not rule by fear alone. He advocates fiercely for his soldiers, arguing for their pay, their provisions, and their dignity. He shares their discomfort, sleeping in the same rough conditions, enduring the same shortages. Those who serve under him notice this balance. Years later, veterans will speak of his fairness, his insistence on order, paired with a visible willingness to endure alongside those he commands. In 1758, Washington joins a renewed British effort to seize Fort Duquesne. This time, the campaign is better planned, better supplied, and better adapted to the realities of American terrain. When the army finally reaches its objective, they find the fort abandoned, destroyed by retreating French forces. The moment is quiet, almost anticlimactic, but decisive. The Ohio country is finally secured. The balance of the war in North America has shifted decisively in Britain's favor. Washington's long frontier service is nearing its end. By now, he has accumulated years of hard-earned experience. He has learned command under pressure, coordination with allies, and the limits of rigid doctrine. His personal courage is no longer in doubt. His reputation is secure. And yet, beneath it all, dissatisfaction has taken root. Washington has seen how British officers regard colonial counterparts as socially inferior, professionally suspect, regardless of performance or sacrifice. He has watched capable men dismissed, their experience undervalued. The resentment is quiet, controlled, but it does not fade. In December of 1758, George Washington resigns his commission. He is 26 years old. For the first time since his youth, he steps away from military life, believing, sincerely, that he is finished with war. He has other plans now. Domestic plans. Plans rooted in land, family, and stability. Plans for a quieter life along the Potomac. Let yourself drift further into rest as this chapter closes. The urgency of marching columns and distant gunfire softens and recedes. Ahead lies a slower rhythm, the turning of seasons, the measured work of building a household, the routines of plantation life. For now there is peace. Part 3, Mount Vernon and Growing Discontent, 1759, 1775. January 6, 1759. You are in a warm, candlelit parlor in New Kent County, Virginia. The light reflects softly on polished wood. Outside, winter rain taps steadily against the windows, a quiet percussion accompanying the day. George Washington stands in his finest clothes. He is 26 years old. Today, he marries Martha Dandridge Custis, a widow with 2 young children. Martha brings more than companionship to the union. Her late husband's estate makes her one of the wealthiest women in Virginia. With this marriage, Washington's social and economic standing rises dramatically. But wealth is not the only measure. Martha herself is described by contemporaries as petite, warm, practical, a skilled manager of household and estate. She is capable, deliberate, and steady. The relationship may lack the sweeping romance of novels, but it contains something more durable: respect, partnership, and affection. Washington becomes a devoted stepfather. He takes responsibility for Jackie and Patsy with attentiveness and care. Their well-being, education, and guidance become part of his daily concern, shaping his emerging sense of family as both duty and commitment. After the wedding, the couple settles at Mount Vernon, the Potomac plantation Washington inherited from Lawrence's widow. The house sits atop a gentle rise overlooking the river, its position commanding a wide view of water, fields, and forest. In 1759, Mount Vernon is modest, yet promising. Over the coming years, Washington will expand it, renovate it, and refine it, transforming it into the elegant mansion that will survive into the modern era as a symbol of his legacy. Let yourself drift into the rhythms of plantation life. Days begin early, often before sunrise. Washington rides through his holdings, moving across fields, barns, and workshops. He meets with overseers, inspects crops, and makes careful notes about what should be planted where, which structures need repair, and which workers, enslaved and free, possess particular skills suited to specific tasks. Mount Vernon is not a single farm, but a network of 5 distinct farms, encompassing roughly 8,000 acres. Managing it is akin to running a small town. Finances, labor, production, and logistics must all be coordinated. Washington proves himself to be an innovative and attentive farmer. He experiments with crop rotation, soil conservation, and livestock management. He studies weather patterns, soil conditions, and market trends. His work is steady, deliberate, and informed by the discipline and observation he honed in military life. In this quiet period, Washington's mind is at once occupied and free. The frontier battles and European campaigns have passed, but his intellect and ambition do not rest. Here, on the banks of the Potomac, he learns the complexities of land, labor, and legacy, the foundations of influence and authority that will later support far greater responsibilities. While most Virginia planters remain focused almost exclusively on tobacco, Washington takes a different approach. He diversifies. Wheat becomes a central experiment, proving more profitable and less exhausting to the soil than tobacco. He tests various fertilizers, implements crop rotation, and studies new methods for cultivating fields efficiently. His curiosity is deliberate and disciplined, informed by observation, measurement, and calculation, the same qualities that served him in surveying and military service. Washington reads widely on agriculture, consulting treatises from Britain and exchanging letters with other progressive farmers in the colonies. His meticulous journals fill volumes, recording rainfall, crop yields, livestock breeding, and the progress of construction projects across Mount Vernon. Each page demonstrates methodical care and a mind attuned to systems, patterns, and results. Yet the plantation runs on enslaved labor. By the 1770s, more than 300 men, women, and children live and work at Mount Vernon. This reality is one of the deepest contradictions in Washington's life. While his personal correspondence sometimes reveals moral unease about slavery, and his will eventually provides for the freedom of his enslaved workers after Martha's death, during these decades he participates fully in the institution. He buys and sells enslaved people, often breaking families apart when economic circumstances demand it, and he actively enforces their captivity. The historical record demands acknowledgement of this complexity without simplification or justification. The days unfold with a measured rhythm, marked by the seasons. Spring brings planting, the smell of freshly turned earth, and the planting of crops for maximum yield. Summer brings intense labor, weeding, cultivating, tending livestock, and ensuring crops thrive. Autumn arrives with the harvest, a flurry of activity as Washington and his overseers race to gather crops before frost or storms arrive. Winter brings reflection, preparation, and repair, tools mended, fields cleared, plans made for the next cycle. Time moves predictably here, but it is exacting. and Washington embraces its lessons in diligence and management. Alongside his work in the fields, Washington pursues the life of a Virginia gentleman. He serves in the House of Burgesses, representing Fairfax County. He is not a naturally flamboyant or eloquent speaker. Instead, he favors written communication, expressing thought with care and precision. Yet he is diligent, reliable, and respected by colleagues. His presence matters. Social life is another sphere of engagement. Washington attends balls, horse races, fox hunts, and formal dinners. He orders clothing and furnishings from London, participates in the refined tastes of the colonial elite, and keeps connections that span the Atlantic. These experiences tie him to the culture, customs, and expectations of the planter class, even as his attention remains focused on land, management, and the long-term legacy of Mount Vernon. Here, on the banks of the Potomac, George Washington continues to grow. He balances enterprise and family, politics and agriculture, personal ambition and public expectation. Each day adds a layer of skill, patience, and understanding. Each season strengthens the routines and structures that will shape not only his estate, but the larger role he is gradually preparing to assume. Washington is a devoted and attentive father to his stepchildren. Historical records show his particular affection for Patsy, who suffers from severe epilepsy. He spares no effort in her care, summoning doctors, exploring every available treatment, sitting vigil through her seizures. His attention is constant, practical, and tender, revealing a side of him often overshadowed by public achievements. When Patsy dies in 1773 at the age of 17, Washington's grief is profound. The loss touches him deeply. In quiet acts of generosity, he cancels debts owed by neighbors and friends, as if trying to restore some balance or offer solace in response to sorrow. His letters from this period convey the struggle of a man confronting helplessness, mortality, and the limits of human effort. Let these years wash over you like slow, steady water. Feel the repetition of daily life, the deepening roots of a family, the rhythms of work and care that accumulate into meaning. The candlelight in Mount Vernon's parlor grows dimmer with the evening, and outside, the Potomac flows dark and constant, carrying time quietly onward. Yet beyond the estate's peaceful rhythms, larger tensions are stirring. Britain has emerged victorious from the 7 Years' War, but the victory brings immense debt. Parliament looks to the colonies to share the cost of their defense, and a series of taxes and regulations follows. The Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, the Townshend Acts. In Virginia and across the colonies, resistance begins to build. The taxes themselves are burdensome, but the principle behind them is more troubling. Parliament is taxing colonists without their consent, without representation in that governing body. The old rallying cry gains renewed energy. No taxation without representation. Washington observes these developments with growing concern. His personal finances provide additional reasons for frustration. Like many Virginia planters, he is deeply indebted to British merchants. Caught in a system in which tobacco is shipped abroad, goods are purchased from London, and profits are slow to return home. Restrictions on trade and colonial manufacturing compound his difficulties. Through this period, Washington's correspondence reveals a mind stirring toward political consciousness. He begins to see the colonies not merely as distant provinces of the British Empire, but as communities with legitimate interests, rights, and identities. The man who once moved with quiet purpose through forests and fields is now turning that same careful observation toward governance, law, and justice. Here, at Mount Vernon, Washington's domestic life and the larger currents of empire converge. The estate remains a place of growth, care, and routine, even as the world beyond the Potomac moves inexorably toward conflict. The break comes gradually, then suddenly. After the Boston Tea Party in December 1773, Britain responds with a series of harsh measures, known to colonists as the Coercive Acts, or the Intolerable Acts. Massachusetts bears the brunt. Boston's port is closed, the colony's charter is revoked, and local governance is strictly curtailed. Across Virginia and the other colonies, outrage spreads. The House of Burgesses in Virginia votes to observe a day of fasting and prayer in solidarity with Massachusetts. The gesture is symbolic, yet powerful, a quiet declaration of unity. The royal governor responds swiftly, dissolving the House and attempting to suppress colonial dissent. But the delegates are undeterred. They reconvene unofficially at Raleigh Tavern in Williamsburg, meeting in secret to avoid reprisal. Discussions turn toward broader coordination. If the colonies are to resist, they must act together. They call for a Congress of all the colonies. George Washington is selected as one of Virginia's delegates to this first Continental Congress, a recognition of his leadership, experience, and steady reputation. In September 1774, Washington sets out for Philadelphia. The journey takes several days, traveling by horseback and coach across rolling Virginia countryside. Each mile carries him further from the quiet rhythms of Mount Vernon and closer to the political heart of the colonies. Philadelphia welcomes him with bustle and sophistication. The streets are crowded with merchants, laborers, and officials. The city hums with energy. Carpenter's Hall, where the Congress meets, is modest in size but grand in purpose. Delegates from 12 colonies gather. Georgia has not yet sent representatives. Among them are familiar names of leadership and influence: Samuel Adams and John Adams from Massachusetts, Patrick Henry and Richard Henry Lee from Virginia, John Jay from New York. They carry the hopes, fears, and authority of their constituents. Washington speaks little during the debates. He is cautious, measured, observing more than directing. But his presence carries weight. He wears his old military uniform, a subtle reminder that the colonies are not helpless, that they have trained soldiers ready to defend their rights if necessary. The Congress works methodically. Petitions to the king are drafted. Plans for a boycott of British goods are organized. The delegates assert the colony's rights as Englishmen, arguing for representation and fair governance. Most still hope for reconciliation within the empire. But the careful undertone is clear. Preparation for other possibilities is already underway. In November, Washington returns to Mount Vernon. The estate requires attention. Fields must be planned, crops sown, overseers managed. Yet his letters and correspondence increasingly focus on politics, military organization, and the growing likelihood of armed conflict. The rhythms of plantation life continue, but they now run parallel to a larger unfolding story. A story that will demand all the experience, judgment, and resilience Washington has accumulated over decades of life, service, and leadership. In April 1775, news reaches the colonies. British troops and colonial militia have exchanged fire at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts. Shots have been fired. Lives have been lost. The fragile hope of reconciliation shatters. War has begun, though few yet dare call it by that name. The Second Continental Congress convenes in Philadelphia in May 1775. Washington attends once more, wearing his military uniform. The old coat, the polished boots, and the faint creak of his sword at his side are subtle reminders. The colonies have men ready, trained, and capable of organized resistance. Let yourself drift alongside him on the journey. The Virginia countryside rolls past slowly. Green fields, dense forests, rivers to ford. Occasional taverns where riders pause for meals and fresh horses. The rhythm of travel is steady, contemplative, punctuated by the sounds of hoofbeats and wind through the trees. Philadelphia rises ahead, its spires and brick buildings clustered along the Delaware River, welcoming and imposing all at once. The streets are busy with merchants, carriages, and townspeople. The scent of the river mingles with smoke from chimneys and the faint tang of the marketplace. Inside Carpenter's Hall, the Congress gathers. The room hums with urgent conversation. Delegates confer, debate, and draft petitions. Letters from distant colonies arrive by courier, recounting skirmishes, troop movements, and public sentiment. Washington listens, observes, and contemplates. Everything is about to change. The quiet of Mount Vernon, the routines of planting and household management, the slow accumulation of experience, all of it converges here in this moment. Washington is no longer simply a planter, a surveyor, or a colonial legislator. He is poised to take command of a nascent army, to lead men in a struggle whose scale, consequence, and uncertainty are unlike anything he has faced before. Let the sense of anticipation settle around you. Feel the gravity of the time, the weight of decision, and the faint pulse of history in motion. The world is on the brink, and George Washington is standing at the edge, ready to step forward. Part 4. The Revolution, 1775-1783. Congress faces an immediate crisis. Outside Boston, colonial militia has gathered, surrounding British forces in the city. The siege is precarious. The nascent army requires a commander-in-chief. But the choice is not only military, it is deeply political. New England has sparked a struggle. To ensure the effort is recognized as truly continental, the leader must come from another colony. Washington, from Virginia, becomes the natural candidate. John Adams nominates him. The reasoning is practical. Washington has military experience. He is respected across colonies, and he has demonstrated willingness by appearing in his uniform. On June 15, 1775, the Continental Congress unanimously elects George Washington as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army. Washington accepts, delivering a short speech that reveals both humility and resolve. He acknowledges his own inadequacies, worries he may not be equal to the task, and requests no salary beyond expenses. His modesty is genuine. He understands the enormity of the responsibility and the risks. Failure could mean not only defeat, but the charge of treason, potentially punishable by execution. Before departing Philadelphia, he writes to Martha. The letter survives, a window into his private reflection. It has been determined in Congress that the whole army raised for the defense of the American cause shall be put under my care. I am now to bid adieu to you, and to every kind of domestic ease for a while. He asks her to find comfort in his sense of duty and promises to return safely, though he cannot know if that hope will be realized. In early July, you ride north with him toward Boston. The army gathered at Cambridge is more an assembly than a disciplined force. Militia units arrive from different colonies, each with its own methods, loyalties, and expectations. Uniforms are rare, organization is inconsistent, and many basic supplies are missing. Officers are sometimes elected by their troops, rather than appointed for competence. Discipline is irregular. Men come and go as they please. Washington surveys this fledgling force with a mixture of concern and determination. He sees chaos, but he also sees potential. The challenge before him is immense: to transform a collection of individuals into a cohesive army capable of facing the most formidable military power of the era. Let yourself settle into the rhythm of this journey. Feel the Virginia countryside slide past, the whispers of trees and the warmth of summer sun. Sense the weight of responsibility Washington carries, and the quiet courage required to step into history's unfolding moment. Washington begins the work of transformation. He establishes headquarters in a modest house in Cambridge. From there, he tours the siege lines around Boston, observing each position, meeting officers, and carefully noting how British forces are deployed within the city. He issues orders to maintain sanitation, reduce disease, enforce discipline, and ensure that the army operates as a cohesive force rather than a collection of militias. He writes incessantly to Congress. His letters request supplies, authority to organize the army effectively, and the resources necessary to sustain a prolonged war effort. Every day is filled with assessment, planning, and administration, even as the men under his command struggle with shortages, homesickness, and inexperience. The winter of 1775-76 passes in this stalemate. British forces under General Howe remain secure within Boston. Washington's army surrounds them, but without artillery, proper fortifications, and consistent supply lines, they cannot force the British from the city. Frustration simmers beneath Washington's calm exterior. Inaction feels dangerous, and every delay risks morale and order. Then in March, heavy cannon captured from Fort Ticonderoga arrive. Washington seizes the moment. He moves swiftly to occupy Dorchester Heights, commanding the high ground overlooking Boston and placing the captured artillery there. The British position suddenly become untenable. General Howe evacuates Boston by sea, retreating to Halifax. It is Washington's first significant victory of the war, accomplished without a major battle. Yet there is no time for celebration. Intelligence and common sense warn that the British will return in greater force. Washington orders his army to New York, anticipating the next theater of conflict. Let the scene shift. It is late summer of 1776. You stand on Manhattan Island, feeling the heat of summer and the tension in the air. The city is busy and uneasy. Washington's army is spread across Manhattan, Long Island, and the banks of the Hudson River, attempting to defend an impossible position. The British Navy dominates the waters, able to land troops anywhere along the coast and outflank any fixed fortification. Then, on July 4th, word arrives. Congress has declared independence. The fragile hope of reconciliation is gone. The war is now explicitly a struggle for the creation of a new nation. The stakes are immeasurable. Washington gathers his troops. The declaration is read aloud, words meant to inspire courage and resolve. Yet inspiration must contend with reality. The army is raw, the city vulnerable, the enemy experienced and overwhelming in number. Every decision, every movement will carry immense weight, and the shadow of risk stretches long across the Hudson. Let yourself settle into this tension, this anticipation, as the scene holds you in place. The wind from the river, the smell of smoke, the distant cries from training grounds, all are part of the unfolding story. History is in motion, and George Washington stands at its center, poised between uncertainty and destiny. In late August 1776, General Howe lands a massive force on Long Island, over 20,000 British and Hessian troops, the largest expeditionary force Britain has ever sent overseas. Washington has divided his army to defend multiple positions across the island, spreading his already limited forces dangerously thin. The Battle of Long Island is a disaster. British troops, well-trained and expertly maneuvered, outflank and overwhelm the American positions. Panic spreads through the ranks. Only Washington's skillful nighttime evacuation across the East River spares the army from complete destruction, saving the men for future campaigns. The retreat continues relentlessly. Washington abandons New York City, moves northward, then crosses the Hudson into New Jersey, pursued by British forces. By December, the Continental Army has dwindled to a few thousand men. They are cold, exhausted, demoralized. Supply shortages and harsh winter weather compound the challenge. Morale is fragile. The cause seems on the verge of collapse. Feel the cold of that December night. You are standing on the Pennsylvania riverbank, watching chunks of ice drift in the dark, fast-moving water. Behind you, the ragged army huddles around insufficient fires. Many soldiers lack shoes. Their bleeding footprints mark the retreat path. Enlistments will expire at year's end, and most men will soon be legally free to return home. Washington faces a desperate choice. On Christmas night, he orders the army to recross the Delaware River and launch an attack on the Hessian garrison at Trenton. The risk is enormous. Failure could annihilate the army entirely. Yet doing nothing guarantees the army's dissolution, the collapse of the revolutionary effort before it truly begins. The crossing is grueling. The river is choked with ice. Snow falls, then sleet, then freezing rain. Men row and push through water near freezing, their muscles screaming from exhaustion. Dawn breaks as the frozen, weary troops finally reach the far shore and march toward Trenton. The Hessians, recovering from Christmas celebrations, are completely unprepared. The Americans strike swiftly. The battle lasts less than an hour. Nearly 1,000 prisoners are captured. Remarkably, the Continental Army suffers no combat fatalities. This victory is more than tactical. It restores hope. Morale surges. The army, though battered, remains intact. Washington has demonstrated that boldness, timing, and careful planning can overcome desperation and adversity. The winter campaign is far from over, but for the first time in months, the promise of possibility replaces the despair of retreat. The victory at Trenton carries psychological weight far beyond its immediate strategic importance. The cause, which had seemed on the verge of collapse, is revived. Men re-enlist, inspired by Washington's daring leadership and the Army's renewed hope. He follows quickly with another triumph at Princeton, and the Army moves into winter quarters at Morristown. Battered but intact, still a living threat to British ambitions. Let these events blur now, blending into the long, arduous middle years of the war. The Continental Army survives 1777, though just barely. British forces capture Philadelphia, the political heart of the rebellion. Washington's attempt to defend the city fails at the Battle of Brandywine. A counterattack at Germantown almost succeeds but ultimately falls short. Meanwhile, a northern campaign from Canada is decisively defeated at Saratoga by American forces under Gates and Arnold, a victory pivotal enough to bring France into the war as an American ally. Winter 1777-78 finds the Continental Army encamped at Valley Forge, some 20 miles from British-occupied Philadelphia. The encampment becomes legendary for its suffering. Supply systems have collapsed. Men lack sufficient food, blankets, and adequate shelter. Disease, cold, and malnutrition claim lives. Washington writes anguished letters to Congress, to state governors, to anyone who might provide relief. In one he confesses, "Our present sufferings are not indeed nomated." His way of saying the hardships are too great to put into words. Yet, Valley Forge is also a place of transformation. Baron von Steuben, a Prussian officer, arrives to drill the army in European military maneuvers, discipline, and coordination. For the first time, the Continental Army begins to operate as a professional fighting force. When they march out of Valley Forge in June 1778, they are fundamentally different from the militia that arrived months before. Disciplined, cohesive, and resilient. The war's character changes as well. France's entry transforms the conflict into a global struggle. British forces must now defend far-flung territories, while Washington coordinates with French allies, manages the expectations of Congress and state governments, and holds his army together during years when decisive victories are rare. Strategy, patience, and leadership take precedence over immediate triumph. Let yourself feel the quiet strength of this period. The hardship, the preparation, the discipline, all are shaping the men, the army, and the general who leads them. Every snowbound night, every exhausted march, every carefully planned maneuver contributes to the long arc of history in motion, as Washington guides his forces through the dark toward eventual victory. Let the years flow past like river water. 1778, 1779, 1780, years of marching and countermarching, of skirmishes and careful positioning, of endless letters, calculations, and strategy. In the north, the war settles into a stalemate. Battles at places like Monmouth demonstrate courage, but yield little strategic change. Washington's army is disciplined and capable, but it is never adequately supplied or paid. Food, clothing, and ammunition are perpetually scarce. Morale ebbs and flows, dependent on leadership, luck, and winter encampments. Major action shifts to the south. British forces capture Charleston in 1780 and score victories in the Carolinas at Camden and Waxhaws, threatening to consolidate control. Washington responds by sending reinforcements and coordinating with capable officers like Nathanael Greene, who employs skillful maneuver warfare to frustrate British forces and preserve American control over large swaths of territory. Washington endures trials beyond the battlefield. Soldiers mutiny, often from sheer desperation at unpaid wages or inadequate rations. In 1780, Benedict Arnold, once a hero of the northern campaigns, defects to the British, nearly handing over West Point, a strategic fortress on the Hudson River. The betrayal shakes Washington profoundly. Arnold had been someone he trusted, a man whose talents he respected, a fellow officer who shared the burdens of command. The shock is personal, as well as strategic, revealing the vulnerability of even the most loyal leadership networks. Through these years, Washington's greatest achievement is simple but monumental: keeping the army in existence. He masters the art of endurance, asking men to bear more than they perhaps should. He navigates the treacherous politics between Congress, the individual states, and the French alliance. His correspondence fills volumes. Letters to Congress meticulously detailing supply needs and troop conditions. Letters to state governors pleading for support and reinforcements. Letters to his officers maintaining cohesion and authority. Letters to Martha suffused with longing, domestic concern. The deep human cost of war. He ages visibly. Portraits from the war years show the transformation. The once confident colonel of the 1770s, now a weathered, dignified general. Lines crease his face. Eyes reflect the burden of responsibility, sleepless nights, and the moral weight of commanding men's lives. His physical presence exudes authority, but also weariness born of relentless pressure. Then, in 1781, opportunity finally arrives. A French fleet under Admiral de Grasse sails to the Chesapeake. British forces under Cornwallis are operating in Virginia, overextended and vulnerable. If Washington can move swiftly, coordinate perfectly with the French fleet, and synchronize with French forces under General Rochambeau, Cornwallis may be trapped at Yorktown, a decisive strike that could end the war. It's an immense logistical challenge. Washington must march his army hundreds of miles from New York, deceiving British forces about his intentions to prevent them from reinforcing Cornwallis. Every movement is calculated. Every camp, every river crossing, every supply line must be considered. French troops march alongside the Americans, their coordination crucial. Communication is slow, vulnerable, and dependent on couriers. Misstiming any element could mean disaster. Let yourself feel the weight of this planning, the tenseness of anticipation, the care and skill Washington brings to each decision. The general who once crossed icy rivers at Trenton now orchestrates the most complex campaign of his career. The outcome rests not only on courage, but on timing, trust, and the meticulous alignment of armies, ships, and human will across miles of hostile territory. You are standing on the Virginia Peninsula in October 1781. The French fleet has arrived, commanding the Chesapeake Bay and preventing any British naval relief. Cornwallis is trapped at Yorktown, his back to the sea, facing a combined American and French force numbering over 17,000 men. The siege begins with methodical European formality. Parallels are dug, artillery batteries positioned, and supply lines established. Night and day, the guns roar, sending thunderous volleys toward the British defenses. Soldiers endure long hours of labor and exposure, shifting earth, hauling cannon, and digging trenches with tireless determination. Washington moves among them, observing, directing, and maintaining morale. On October 19, 1781, the siege reaches its conclusion. Cornwallis surrenders. British troops march out of their fortifications and lay down their arms. The British band plays "The World Turned Upside Down," a symbolic tune for a world in transformation. Washington, mounted, dignified, and quietly composed, watches. He has maintained equanimity through 6 long years of war, through defeats, retreats, shortages, and bitter winters that would have broken lesser men. Now, at last, the end of major combat is in sight. Though major operations cease, formal war continues for nearly 2 more years as diplomats negotiate peace terms. Washington keeps his army together at Newburgh, New York, overseeing men who are restless, underpaid, and anxious about the uncertain future. His careful management prevents unrest from turning into disaster, balancing firmness with empathy. In March 1783, Washington faces perhaps his most delicate test. Some officers, frustrated by Congress' failure to pay them, consider marching on Philadelphia to force the issue. A few even hint that Washington himself might seize power as monarch or dictator, a temptation not lost on military men familiar with history, where victorious generals often took crowns for themselves. Washington addresses his officers at Newburgh. He begins by reading a letter from Congress that explains their financial difficulties. But the weight of responsibility and age shows. His voice falters. He reaches into his pocket and pulls out spectacles, something few officers have ever seen him use. "Gentlemen," he says, "you must pardon me. I have grown gray in your service, and now find myself growing blind." The spectacle of vulnerability, the humility in acknowledging his own limitations, strikes the officers profoundly. Washington's appeal to duty, honor, and the ideals for which they fought diffuses tension. The army remains under control. The fragile republic is preserved, not only by victory on the battlefield, but by restraint, moral authority, and commitment to the principles of governance over personal ambition. Let yourself feel the weight of this moment. The long years of sacrifice, hardship, and courage are crystallized here. Washington embodies the delicate balance between power and principle, and through him, the American experiment survives its first true test. The simple human moment breaks the tension. These men have followed Washington through 6 years of war. They have endured frost-bitten winters, grueling marches, and near starvation. They have seen him share in their hardships, uphold discipline with fairness, and consistently refuse to seize power for himself. They will not betray him now. The fragile civilian government survives because of his restraint, his integrity, and the example he has set. On December 4, 1783, Washington bids farewell to his officers at Fraunces Tavern in New York. Emotion chokes his voice. He embraces each man, offering quiet words of thanks, encouragement, and personal remembrance. These soldiers have been his companions, confidants, and witnesses to the extraordinary trials of the Revolution. When he steps away, it is a profound closure to 8 years of relentless responsibility. Washington journeys to Annapolis, where Congress is convened. On December 23rd, he appears before the Assembly in the Maryland State House. The room is silent, the moment weighty with symbolism. Washington resigns his commission, voluntarily relinquishing supreme military power and returning to civilian life, a gesture without precedent in modern history. The significance is immediately recognized. King George III, reportedly hearing of Washington's resignation, declares, "If he does that, he will be the greatest man in the world." Washington's act becomes a model of Republican virtue and restraint, a statement that the new nation will be governed by law, not by force of arms. On Christmas Eve, Washington returns to Mount Vernon. He has been away, except for brief visits, for 8.5 years. He is 51, a man tempered by battle, responsibility, grief, and triumph. The plantation, the familiar roads, the Potomac flowing quietly beside the house, all offer a long-awaited sanctuary. Martha waits, a steadfast partner who has maintained the home and estate throughout these years of separation. Let yourself rest now, in this moment of return. Picture the familiar road approaching Mount Vernon, the house emerging through the trees, smoke curling from the chimneys, Martha waiting on the steps. The war is over. Relief flows through him like a river long dammed, a burden finally set down. The fields he tended, the rivers he once rode along as a boy, the rhythms of plantation life, all welcome him home. The extraordinary weight of leadership and responsibility lifts, leaving him simply George Washington, husband, planter, and private citizen. In this stillness, feel the echo of history, the courage, the perseverance, the moral authority that allowed a fledgling nation to survive and endure. The story of a general, a leader, and a man returns to the quiet rhythm of life beside the Potomac. Peace at last is here. Part 5. The Presidency, 1789-1797. But the story does not end with peaceful retirement. The new nation Washington helped create is struggling to stand on its own. The Articles of Confederation, the fledgling governing document, prove inadequate. States quarrel over boundaries, tariffs, and trade. Congress cannot raise revenue, cannot maintain a standing army, cannot regulate commerce effectively. The economy falters. Debt mounts. Confidence wavers. In Massachusetts, in 1786, farmers take up arms in Shays' Rebellion, protesting taxes and foreclosure. The revolution has succeeded, but the nation it created teeters on collapse. Washington, observing these events from Mount Vernon, feels unease. A republic without authority, without unity, risks dissolving into chaos. In 1787, delegates gather in Philadelphia to revise the Articles. Washington, despite his preference for private life, feels duty calling again. Virginia selects him as a delegate. More than that, the convention unanimously elects him as presiding officer. His presence commands respect, inspires confidence, and reassures skeptical states that the deliberations will be orderly and serious. Outside, Philadelphia swelters under oppressive heat. Fans of paper and cloth flutter. Sunlight filters through high windows. Inside, delegates debate fundamental questions of government: representation, taxation, executive authority, checks and balances. Washington says little in the debates. His role is to preside, not to argue. But his measured demeanor and attentive listening lend weight to every decision. Delegates understand that whatever document they produce will require Washington's support to succeed. The debates continue through the summer. Delegates argue passionately over the balance of power between states and the federal government, over slavery, over the structure of the legislature. The document that emerges, the Constitution, creates a stronger federal government, establishes an executive branch headed by a president, and defines the separation of powers. Almost immediately, it is clear that Washington is the ideal candidate for the office. The presidency, in many ways, is conceived with him in mind. Washington has deep reservations. He is 55, accustomed to the quiet rhythms of plantation life, the Potomac flowing past Mount Vernon, the solace of family and domestic routines. The Constitution has yet to be ratified. It might fail, and his reputation could be tarnished by association. Even if it succeeds, the presidency carries impossible expectations, the weight of a fledgling nation's hopes, and inevitable criticism. He writes to friends with humility and hesitation, expressing reluctance, a desire to remain in private life, and a sense of being pulled from happiness back into public duty. But he understands the stakes. The nation needs him. The Constitution is ratified. The Electoral College convenes. On April 30th, 1789, Washington stands on the balcony of Federal Hall in New York City, ready to take the oath of office. The streets below are crowded with citizens, cheering, waving, and aware that they are witnessing the birth of a presidency unlike any the world has seen. Washington places his hand on the Bible, speaks the oath, and becomes the first president of the United States, a man whose life has spanned revolution, hardship, triumph, and now the delicate responsibility of guiding a new nation into the future. The balcony of Federal Hall in New York City glows in the morning sunlight. Washington steps forward and takes the oath of office as the first president of the United States. Picture the scene. A spring morning, church bells ringing across Manhattan, citizens gathered in the streets, waving and craning to see history unfold. Washington wears a suit of brown broadcloth, manufactured in America, a deliberate choice, signaling support for domestic industry and independence from British imports. He places his hand on a Bible, speaks the words of the oath slowly and deliberately, and adds at the end the phrase, "Not in the Constitution. So help me God." Then he bends and kisses the Bible. The crowd erupts into cheers. Cannons fire salutes across the harbor. He is inaugurated, but the meaning of the office is undefined. There is no precedent, no ceremonial playbook, no accumulated wisdom to guide him. Everything he does now will shape the presidency itself. Questions swirl around him. How should the president be addressed? Titles like His High Mightiness and His Elective Majesty are debated in Congress, before the simple democratic solution prevails. Mr. President, how formal should the office be? Washington balances dignity and accessibility, holding weekly levees where citizens and petitioners may meet him while maintaining decorum. How should the president interact with Congress? Washington delivers messages in person, establishing the precedent for the annual State of the Union address. How should cabinet meetings function? He meets regularly with his department heads, seeking counsel, but ultimately making decisions himself, establishing the foundation of executive authority. Should the president travel to see the nation or remain in the capital? Washington tours New England and the southern states, demonstrating visibility, unity, and personal connection with citizens across a sprawling, diverse young republic. Can the president remove appointed officials, or is Senate approval required? Through careful precedent, he asserts executive authority over his administration while respecting constitutional checks. On the world stage, the questions are no less urgent. How should the United States navigate between Britain and France, the two dominant European powers whose rivalries ripple across the globe? Washington issues the Proclamation of Neutrality, charting a cautious course that preserves American sovereignty while avoiding entanglement in foreign wars. Every action, every policy, every ritual he establishes becomes a guide for successors, shaping the office and ensuring that the Republic survives the uncertainties of both domestic and international pressures. Feel the weight of this responsibility as Washington does. The knowledge that every choice carries consequence, that each decision sets a precedent for generations to come. He walks this path with the same measured care, courage, and moral attention that guided him through the storms of revolution, now applying it to the delicate, unprecedented task of leading a new nation in peace. Let yourself drift through these first years of the presidency. The capital moves from New York to Philadelphia, while plans for a new city along the Potomac, Washington, D.C., take shape. Washington's days are long and relentless. He rises before dawn, reviews intelligence and reports, meets with advisors, writes correspondence to Congress, state governors, and foreign leaders, and receives ambassadors whose letters, gestures, and demeanor require careful attention. Martha joins him in this new role, hosting social gatherings, dinners, and receptions, shaping the office of First Lady by her actions and grace. Her skill in managing protocol, welcoming guests, and fostering social cohesion complements Washington's political work, creating the dual public face of the presidency. Together, they embody the authority, dignity, and approachability necessary for the young republic to thrive. The work is exhausting and often fraught. Washington's cabinet is composed of brilliant, ambitious men whose visions for the nation frequently clash. Alexander Hamilton, as Secretary of the Treasury, advocates for a strong federal government, the creation of a national bank, federal assumption of state debts, and policies favoring commerce, trade, and manufacturing. Thomas Jefferson, as Secretary of State, argues for strict adherence to the Constitution, agricultural primacy, and states' rights. Their ideological battles threaten to fracture the administration. Washington mediates constantly, balancing compromise with principle, ensuring the government functions while holding together conflicting factions. The stakes are enormous. Hamilton's financial system stabilizes the nation's credit and establishes credibility with domestic and international lenders, but also creates factions, resentment, and sectional tensions. Decisions about foreign policy, especially regarding revolutionary France and ongoing tensions with Britain, further divide the nation. Jefferson sympathizes with the French cause, seeing it as a continuation of the ideals of liberty. Hamilton, ever cautious, advocates alignment with Britain to safeguard trade and economic stability. Washington ultimately declares neutrality, a stance designed to preserve peace and protect the fragile republic. Though it pleases neither side fully, you can feel the weight on him. Every decision carries consequences beyond the immediate moment. A misstep might unravel the Constitution itself, destabilize commerce, alienate allies, or embolden political rivals. The success of the revolution, the very survival of the nation, is at stake. Washington writes to friends of the burden, describing a life where each choice is fraught with risk, where each action must balance morality, prudence, and precedent. He walks a path no man has walked before, setting the tone for the presidency, not just through law, but through example, temperance, and relentless care. Let yourself sense the gravity, the quiet vigilance, the continuous negotiation between principle and pragmatism. In these years, Washington is not merely a man in office. He is the living embodiment of the nation's hopes, fears, and potential. Each day, each meeting, each letter, each decision lays another stone in the foundation of governance, a legacy whose contours will shape generations yet unborn. Political parties emerge despite the founders' hopes to avoid factionalism. Federalists gather around Hamilton's vision of a strong central government, commercial development, and financial stability. Democratic Republicans coalesce around Jefferson and Madison, advocating states' rights, agricultural primacy, and strict constitutional interpretation. The divisions grow increasingly bitter. Newspapers fan the flames, publishing scathing editorials and accusations. Washington himself becomes a target, accused by opposition presses of monarchical ambition, favoritism, and corruption. The attacks wound him deeply. He has sacrificed years of personal comfort and safety, refused to profit from office, and devoted himself to the national good, yet now faces mistrust and vilification. By 1793, Washington contemplates retirement after one term. The presidency has aged him. Sleepless nights, endless correspondence, and the weight of national responsibility have taken their toll. He longs for Mount Vernon, for the quiet flow of the Potomac, for the rhythms of domestic life. But friends, advisors, and political allies urge him to continue. Hamilton, Jefferson, even some political opponents, warn that stepping away could destabilize the fragile Union. Reluctantly, he agrees to serve a second term, placing duty above personal desire. The second term brings new trials. The Whiskey Rebellion erupts in western Pennsylvania as farmers resist federal taxation on distilled spirits, viewing it as unfair and oppressive. Washington, determined to affirm the authority of the federal government, personally leads a militia force into the region. His presence underscores the seriousness of the rebellion. The show of force succeeds without major bloodshed, setting a precedent. The Constitution grants the federal government the power and will to enforce its laws. Foreign policy grows increasingly complex. The French Revolution has devolved into chaos and terror. Britain and France are at war, seizing American ships, trading with the other. Britain continues to occupy frontier forts in violation of the Treaty of Paris. Washington dispatches John Jay to negotiate with Britain. Jay's treaty secures the evacuation of British forts and opens limited trade opportunities, but it is deeply unpopular. Many Americans feel it concedes too much to Britain, fails to protect American sailors from impressment, and favors commercial elites. Tensions within the cabinet and Congress escalate. Jefferson resigns in frustration, leaving the administration divided. Madison leads the opposition in Congress, criticizing Hamilton's economic policies and Washington's approach to neutrality. The political atmosphere grows poisonous. Partisanship deepens, undermining national unity. Washington, now in his mid-60s, an advanced age in the era, feels the strain physically and emotionally. He grows weary, frustrated by factionalism and the persistent challenges of leadership. Determined to preserve the example of voluntary service and Republican restraint, he resolves that this second term will be his last. Let yourself sense the weight of his years, the relentless pressures, the toll of steering a young nation through uncharted waters. Despite exhaustion, Washington continues to embody the principles of duty, moderation, and moral authority, leaving a legacy of steady leadership and precedent that will define the office of the presidency for generations. Let the scene shift to September 1796. Washington sits at his desk in Philadelphia, quill in hand, candlelight flickering across the papers before him. He works carefully on his farewell address, collaborating with Hamilton on the draft, but the core ideas, The warnings, the guidance, the tone of restraint are entirely his own. They have been honed through 8 years as president, through years of military command, and through a lifetime of public service and reflection. The address is intended for publication, not public delivery. In it, Washington offers his final counsel to the nation. He urges Americans to cherish unity, warning of the baneful effects of the spirit of party, recognizing that partisan divisions have already strained the young republic. He emphasizes the necessity of maintaining the Union, arguing that the diverse regions, North and South, coastal and interior, must support each other, for collective strength is the foundation of survival. On foreign policy, he counsels prudence. Permanent alliances, he argues, risk entangling the United States in conflicts not its own. Commercial relations are essential, but political connection with foreign powers must be avoided. The young nation must retain freedom of action, guided by its own interests rather than the quarrels of distant European monarchs. Above all, the address embodies restraint. Washington is stepping down voluntarily, establishing the precedent of peaceful transfer of power, demonstrating that the presidency is a duty, not a personal throne. He could almost certainly remain in office for life, his reputation and stature unmatched, yet he chooses to relinquish authority, showing that leadership in a republic is service, not privilege. The logic of the revolution, the rejection of concentrated power, the emphasis on civic virtue, guides his final act in office. Picture him reading the final draft by candlelight. Outside, Philadelphia sleeps under a starry sky. The streets are silent, except for distant church bells and the occasional clip-clop of a late horse. Washington pauses, reflecting on decades of service, the campaigns of the revolution, the challenges of peace, the painstaking work of creating institutions from nothing. Now he offers one last gift, the example of leaving power voluntarily, of trusting the nation to continue without him. The address is published on September 19, 1796. Its words ripple through newspapers, reaching citizens from Maine to Georgia. The election of 1796 proceeds. John Adams wins, becoming the second president. On March 4, 1797, Washington attends Adams' inauguration, observing the peaceful transition. No violence, no unrest, no personal ambition overrides the process. Feel his relief as he begins the journey south, the familiar landscapes of Virginia unfolding before him. The Potomac glimmers in the sunlight, ferrying the mind back to quiet rivers, forests, and fields. Mount Vernon rises above the river, familiar and welcoming. Washington arrives home at 65 years old, the weight of public life lifting from his shoulders. Finally, he can embrace the rhythms of private life, the quiet companionship of Martha, the maintenance of his estate, the reflection on a life of extraordinary service. He is home at last, carrying the legacy of revolution, governance, and precedent with him into the peaceful days of retirement. The nation he helped to create is poised to continue, guided by the institutions he built, the example he set, and the enduring principles he championed. Part 6. Final Years and Legacy, 1797 to 1799. The years at Mount Vernon are busy despite Washington's advancing age. The plantation demands constant attention. He rides across the farms daily when weather permits, inspecting fields, overseeing crop rotation, assessing construction projects, and planning improvements to roads, mills, and buildings. Mount Vernon is not merely a home. It is a working estate, a complex enterprise requiring constant management. Visitors come frequently, from neighbors to political figures, foreign dignitaries, and citizens curious to see the man who had led a revolution and guided a new nation. Washington receives them graciously, even when his body and spirit long for solitude. Each interaction reflects his careful cultivation of dignity and civility, yet he sometimes masks fatigue behind a reserved courtesy. The institution of slavery weighs increasingly on him. He reflects privately on the moral contradictions of his life. In July 1799, he drafts his will, directing that the 123 enslaved people he owns outright be freed upon Martha's death. He makes additional provisions. The young are to be educated, the elderly and infirm cared for, and the process of emancipation structured to provide some measure of stability. It is not redemption for a lifetime of complicity, but a deliberate acknowledgement of injustice. Martha, understanding the implications, quietly frees the enslaved people during her own lifetime, easing their transition into freedom. Washington follows national affairs with diligence. He reads newspapers, maintains correspondence with political leaders, and comments on legislation and public policy. Partisan divisions disturb him deeply. He fears attempts to undermine the Constitution or concentrate power in ways that threaten the balance he fought to preserve. When relations with France deteriorate in 1798, and Adams asks him to assume command of the army should war erupt, Washington agrees, though he recognizes that at 67 years old, active field service is no longer feasible. The crisis passes without military engagement, but the request underscores the nation's enduring reliance on his leadership. Let yourself settle into the rhythms of these final years. Morning rides across the plantation, feeling the cold air, listening to the river's gentle flow, observing workers and livestock. Afternoons spent reading, corresponding, and planning. Evenings with Martha and guests, candlelight flickering across polished tables, the Potomac's steady presence reminding him of constancy amidst change. Seasons turn: spring planting, summer growth, autumn harvest, winter preparation and reflection. December 1799 arrives cold and damp. On the 12th, Washington rides for hours across the frozen fields and snow-laden roads. He returns home, snow in his hair, and without changing clothes, goes straight to dinner, prioritizing his guests over his own comfort. That night, his throat feels sore. By the next evening, he is hoarse and clearly unwell. His condition deteriorates quickly, a reminder that even the strongest and most disciplined lives are subject to the fragility of the human body. The illness worsens rapidly overnight. By morning, Washington can barely speak or breathe. Martha summons the doctors. They arrive promptly, employing the medical treatments of the era: vigorous bloodletting, purgatives, and blistering. Though intended to heal, these measures likely hasten his decline. Modern medical analysis suggests that he suffered from acute epiglottitis, a severe throat infection causing swelling that closes the airway. Throughout his final hours, Washington faces death with characteristic composure and clarity of mind. He gives careful instructions for his estate and his burial, ensuring that Martha, the household, and his servants understand his wishes. Concerned that the medical knowledge of the day may be imperfect, he requests that his body not be placed in the tomb for at least 3 days, a precaution common in an era fearful of premature burial. He reassures his doctors, saying they should not blame themselves. He knows they have done their utmost. To Martha, he says calmly, "I'm just going. Have me decently buried, and do not let my body be put into the vault in less than 3 days after I am dead." She promises. Around 10 o'clock on the evening of December 14, 1799, George Washington dies at Mount Vernon. He is 67 years old. His last words, spoken quietly while checking his own pulse, are, "'Tis well." The room at Mount Vernon falls silent. The crackle of the hearth is the only sound, a soft, familiar heartbeat amid the stillness. Outside, December darkness cloaks the plantation. Snow rests on the ground. The Potomac flows dark and steady under the winter stars, indifferent yet eternal. A life of extraordinary service, discipline, and principle has ended. But the nation Washington helped forge continues, shaped irrevocably by his leadership. In the days that follow, grief spreads through the young nation. Citizens, leaders, and soldiers mourn the passing of a man who bridged revolution and governance, who embodied civic virtue and restraint. Memorials are planned. Tributes pour in. European observers take note of his death, recognizing the unique precedent he set. A victorious general who voluntarily relinquished power, a statesman who placed the republic above personal ambition. Let the quiet settle, over this moment. The fire dims. The wind moves gently through the trees. The Potomac carries on, constant and patient, as does the legacy of George Washington, founding father, soldier, president, an exemplar of civic responsibility. Epilog, memory and meaning. The nation mourns. Newspapers print black-bordered editions. Letters of condolence arrive from far-off states, and citizens hold public gatherings to honor his memory. Congress authorizes a state funeral, unprecedented for a private citizen. Henry, Light Horse Harry, Lee delivers a eulogy that echoes through time. First in war, first in peace, first in the hearts of his countrymen. Mock funerals are held in cities throughout the fledgling nation, and even in Europe. Napoleon orders 10 days of mourning in France. The British fleet lowers its flags in respect. Washington's body is laid to rest in the family vault at Mount Vernon, where it remains today. The plantation itself becomes a site of pilgrimage almost immediately, attracting visitors who seek to connect with the man who shaped the nation. Over time, Mount Vernon becomes more than a home. It is a living memorial, a place to reflect on civic virtue, leadership, and restraint. His legacy unfolds across the centuries. The precedents he established as president, serving only 2 terms, maintaining civilian control of the military, overseeing a peaceful transfer of power, steering the young nation through foreign conflicts with neutrality, remain foundational to American governance. His resignation as commander-in-chief, after leading a successful revolution, becomes a touchstone for emerging democracies worldwide. The capital city on the Potomac, the seat of government he had guided into being, bears his name, Washington. His likeness endures, stamped on currency, carved into Mount Rushmore, a constant reminder of leadership, tempered by principle. Yet his deepest legacy lies not in monuments, coins, or inscriptions, but in the choices he consciously avoided. He could have seized power, ruled by force, or extended his authority indefinitely. He did not. In an age of revolutions that produced Napoleon and countless military strongmen, Washington walked away. He returned to private life, to the rhythms of the Potomac and the quiet work of Mount Vernon, demonstrating that true leadership rests on service rather than self-aggrandizement. Contemporaries recognize the significance. Thomas Jefferson, despite deep political differences, later wrote, "The moderation and virtue of a single character probably prevented this revolution from being closed, as most others have been, by a subversion of that liberty it was intended to establish." King George III, upon hearing of Washington's resignation, reportedly said that he had become the greatest character of the age. Let yourself rest now in this reflection. Washington's life is a river of decisions, trials, victories, and restraint, flowing into the larger story of the nation. The Potomac continues its quiet course. Mount Vernon stands against the sky, timeless and steady. The echoes of courage, discipline, and principle remain, not as commands or laws, but as gentle examples, carrying through centuries, guiding those who seek to understand the delicate balance of power and liberty. The full man was more complex than the marble monuments suggest. He owned enslaved people. He could be vain, ambitious, quick to take offense. He made military mistakes, political misjudgments. But he learned from failures. He grew in wisdom. He placed duty above personal preference time and again. He understood that how he used power would matter more than that he held it. Let yourself rest now with this legacy. Picture Mount Vernon as it stands today, preserved and peaceful above the Potomac. Visitors walk quietly through rooms where Washington lived, linger in the doorway where he watched the river, feel the weight of history in the polished floors and painted walls. The bedroom where he died remains unchanged. The bed where he took his last breath still in place. Outside, his tomb is a simple brick structure, dignified and modest, fitting for a man who refused a crown. The river flows past as it has for centuries, as it did when Washington first saw it as a child, as it did through all the years he lived beside it, and as it does now. Water and time move together, carrying the past forward, wearing down the sharp edges of history into something smooth and continuous. You stand beside the river now in your imagination. The water reflects the soft hues of the evening sky. The air carries the scent of grass, of distant wood smoke, of fields tilled and left to rest. Somewhere across the land, a bell tolls slowly, marking the hour. Everything is still, peaceful, held in the gentle light of a day, ending quietly. Behind you, Mount Vernon rises against the sky, solid and enduring, a testament to a life of labor, vision, and care. Ahead, the Potomac winds toward the Chesapeake, toward the Atlantic, toward all the distances Washington knew and all those he never saw. The water moves without hurry, finding its path naturally, carrying on. And as it flows, the story of George Washington flows with it, steady, enduring, and quietly monumental. Rest now. Let the story settle into silence. Let the images fade, like daylight slipping gently into dusk. You've walked through a life, through years and seasons, through war and peace, through the birth of a nation. The details need not be held. They will remain, preserved in the quiet archive of your mind. The river flows, stars emerge one by one, silver points reflected in dark water. The night deepens, softly, around you. Everything that was urgent has passed into history. Everything that mattered endures in the stillness. Sleep well. The watch is over. The long day is done. The Potomac moves on, peaceful and eternal, carrying time like leaves downstream. It carries you gently toward morning and toward whatever dreams may come in the quiet hours of the night.